Hello viewers, welcome to week 5, lecture 5 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and in this lecture I am going to talk about the concepts of Roman Jakobson. Though we have briefly talked about Jakobson's theory of communication, or how he looks at communication as a universal act, in his essay Linguistics and Poetics. However, here we will be talking about his other concepts in detail as he has evolved. And as we know that Roman Jakobson is a very crucial figure for the movement formalism as well as structuralism. He is a direct link between the two movements as we have seen. So, Jakobson is interested in linguistic orientation of poetics, and he approaches poetry from the linguistics point of view. So, as we have seen in his discussions, that how he provides an account of the poetic function of language using a comprehensive linguistic theory. For Jakobson, poetics is not a separate or ornamental aspect of language, but a fundamental function rooted in how language operates. Central to his theory are two linguistic principles, that of polarities and equivalence. These are drawn from Saussure's concept of syntagmatic, or we can say horizontal and associative or vertical axis of language. And in this way, when we look at all these ideas, we become aware of the binary oppositions, which is the central mode of thinking in structuralist criticism, where all structures and their entities are seen in terms of difference and sameness, contrast and similarities. Whether it is discussion of devices of similarity or metaphor, or discussion of devices of contiguity or metonymy. So, in this way, Jakobson, he talks about the linguistic problems of disorder that can be found in people, and he calls it aphasia. So, he says that aphasia is a loss of power either to understand speech or to make a speech, or maybe both. So, defining aphasia, that kind of problem or disorder, he goes on to say that aphasia is of two kinds or of two forms. One is similarity disorder, which can be understood in terms of metaphoric disorder, or the other is contiguity based disorder, or metonymic disorder. And he says that these similarity based disorder and metonymy based disorder, they are opposed to each other in their very nature. They are based on the principle of binary opposition. Further, Jakobson says that both figures, metaphoric figures and metonymic figures, they are figures of equivalence. They propose a different entity. In what way they are figures of equivalence? For example, if I utter a statement, the car beetled along. If we look at this statement, the car beetled along, there we find that how this statement is making a sense about the speed of the car. So, it is talking about the speed of the car. The car, we can say, the way it is moving, the speed with which it is moving. So, here we find that the speed of car, that is the main object, that is being replaced by the creature beetle. So, in this way, this is metaphorical. And if we look at another statement, so there we find, for example, the White House starts a new policy. There we find that the term White House, it is associated with the president of the USA. So, in this way, this is something which is, a kind of contiguous relationship with the meaning of that sentence. So, Jakobson identifies a binary opposition between metaphor and metonymy, and he considers it as the basis of poetic and linguistic function. He goes on to say that metaphor operates through similarity. It selects substitutes based on resemblance. For example, beetle has been selected because it is synonymous with speeding up. Similarly, metonymy operates through contiguity, where association is based on sequential or spatial relationship, not that of replacement. So, that is how we find that these tropes reflect the two core linguistic operations, selection and combination. So, metaphor corresponds with the vertical associative axis, that is also called the axis of selection, and metonymy is associated with the horizontal or syntagmatic axis, that is also called the axis of combination. So, Jakobson goes on to say that this metaphoric mode, it tends to be foregrounded in poetry, while this metonymic mode, it tends to be foregrounded in prose. So, let us see that what he has to say, how in an utterance or in a work of art, if we are talking about these two functions at linguistic level, so how, how they coexist with each other. He says that how one function is always dominant, the other is dormant. It is not that one function is exclusively there. So, both of the functions are there, though they are in contrast with each other. So, this theory of aphasia, it is, is dependent on, this contrast or language impairments that we find in people with this disease. So, this study of aphasia or disease, it reveals how certain language impairments manifest as dominance of one axis over the other. He goes on to say that, for example, if you look at patients, if a patient is suffering from similarity disorder, so that patient will be totally dependent on metonymic, ordering of things. So, this metaphoric, because this metaphoric deficiency is there, the person will not be capable of using language based on the principle of metaphors, or linguistic function in that person will be dormant or will be suspended. For example, the patient will be using contiguity based, operation or function of language. So, metonymy will be working there because there is a kind of metaphorical disorder. For example, there we find that metonymic, use is very much there. That person may use, fork for knife, or he may use the concept of table for lamp, or he may use the concept of smoke for fire, because he cannot find substitutes. He cannot find replacement on account of his suffering from this similarity disorder. In contrast with that, there is this metonymic disorder in which the person cannot use these metonymic or cannot perform these metonymic linguistic functions. So, there the person is totally dependent on metaphoric function. So, while those with a continuity disorder lose syntactic structuring, but rely heavily on metaphor, they are confined to the substitution of words by similarities of metaphorical nature. So, Jakobson wants to say that the concept of metaphor is quite alien to people who have similarity disorders, and the concept of metonymy is quite alien to people who have this syntagmatic or combinative disorder, or metonymic disorder, right? So, Jakobson goes on to say that how this linguistic breakdown reinforces his claim that metaphor and metonymy, they represent the core dynamics of language, where metaphor can be taken as, if you look at the figure, metaphor can be taken as selective access or associative synchronic, and metaphor this metonymy is combinative or syntagmatic, and in this way that is that also shows the dimension of metonymy or diachronic, right. So, he goes on to say, that the primacy of metaphoric process in the literary schools of Romanticism and Symbolism has been repeatedly acknowledged, but it is still insufficiently realized that it is the predominance of metonymy which underlines and actually predetermines the so-called realistic trend. So, in this way he is making this distinction between the symbolist movement or romantic movement, in which this metaphoric choice or function of language was dominant, and on the other hand we have the entire body of prose fiction which is concerned with that realistic one, and where that metonymic function is predominant. Jakobson talks about this poetic function of language, and he says that the poetic function of language occurs in language when the principle of equivalence is projected into the axis of combination. He says that this poetic function of language occurs when the principle of equivalence is projected from the axis of selection to the axis of combination, or projected from the metaphoric function to the metonymic function. And in this way, he says that this metaphorical selection informs the syntagmatic structure of poetic function. For example, he says that this mechanism distinguishes poetry from prose. For example, if we look at that statement, my car beetles along. So, beetles can be replaced by goes, hurries, scurries, all these words. In this way, he shows the superiority of poetic discourse or poetic function of language. In poetic function of language, this metaphoric function is superimposed, and in this way it gives poetry its symbolic power, its multiplex and polysemantic essence. So, he goes on to say that how poetry foregrounds the metaphoric mode, emphasizing patterns, parallels and similarities in sound and rhythm and imagery, and thereby enriching and complicating language. So, he says that poetic function is also dominant because it is not solely based on the use of imagery. The use of imagery can be found in other forms of language as well, but it also exploits the qualities of repetition, sound patterns by which rhythm and rhyme are generated, and in this way it is more complicated. So far as prose is considered, prose is driven by metonymy and contiguity, and in this way it favors linear arrangement, and in this way it refers to the referential meaning. So, for Jakobson, we need a poetics of both poetry and prose, which will attend to the differential or contrasting functioning of metaphor and metonymy at all levels. Right? Having said that, he goes on to say that the principle of similarities underlies poetry, the metrical parallelism of lines, or the phonic equivalence of rhyming words prompts the question of semantic similarity and contrast. Prose, on the contrary, is forwarded essentially by contiguity. Thus, for poetry, metaphor, and for prose, metonymy is the line of is the line of least resistance. Right. So, in this way, he goes on to say that it is not that poetic function is the sole function of the verbal art. He says that poetic function is only its dominant and determining function, where in all other verbal activities, it acts as a subsidiary or accessory constituent. So, the function by promoting the palpability of signs deepens the functional dichotomy of signs and objects. Hence, when dealing with poetic function, linguistics cannot limit itself to the field of poetry. So, therefore, he says that the so-called realistic literature, intimately tied with the metonymic principle, still defies interpretation. Although the same linguistic methodology which poetics uses when analyzing the metaphorical style of romantic poetry is entirely applicable to the metonymic texture of realistic prose. Right. So, in this way, later on we will see that how there are critics like Remarque, Todorov, Barthes, how they apply these linguistic methods to prose works as well. Let us now talk about Jakobson's theory of communication, how Roman Jakobson draws attention to the 6 constituent factors that make up any speech event. These can be best understood by means of this diagram. Here, this speech event is only an example and it is applicable to various manifestations of linguistic utterances. So, he says that any speech act contains 6 basic elements. There is an addresser, there is an addressee, context, message, contact and code. He says that any communication, it always exists between an addresser and addressee. An addresser has to transmit some message to the addressee. So, these are the two polarities between which the message exists, and message has its own dimensions. For example, if we are talking about a message is always having a context. A message, it can be, framed by using certain codes, and there has always to be a contact between the addresser and the addressee. This, contact could be anything. It could be an oral contact, it could be an visual contact, it could be an electronic contact. The message may be formed of, various codes such as speeches, numbers, writing, sound formations, etc. So, finally, the message must refer to a context understood by both addresser and addressee, which enables the message to make sense. And what is remarkable about Jakobson's this theory of communication, he goes on to say that any kind of message or any kind of this communication is dependent on the total act of communication. We cannot talk about any one aspect, any one function among the given 6 functions, and we cannot make sense of communication in that way. So, here we find that how very much like Shishu, he is also talking about the total structure of communicative system, and each part is related to that communicative system. He goes on to say that the central point is that this Jakobson's account of communication is that message does not and cannot supply all the meaning of the transaction. Meaning, in short, resides in the total act of communication, and it is not a stable, predetermined entity which passes unobstructed from sender to receiver. Right. So, he is trying to say that the message is never constant. It cannot be predefined because it depends on various factors. The code may change, the context may change, the contact may change, and all these elements are capable of bringing a change in the overall message and the meaning of the message that has to be communicated or transmitted. So, the 6 elements which are involved in this message of in this act of communication, they are never in balance. right? Sometimes one aspect dominates the other, and in this way, communication may find itself oriented towards the context in one situation, code in another, or context yet in another, and so on. So in this way, how Jacobson, outlines the corresponding functions of each 6 elements. For example, if a communication is oriented towards the context, then the referential function of language becomes dominant. Because in that way, context is important. So the reference to which it is being referred to, the reality to which it is being referred to, that becomes important. The second thing is that if communication is oriented towards addressor of the message, then emotive function dominates. So, for example, if communication is oriented towards the addressor of the message, then the emotive function dominates. How this emotive function dominates? Suppose we take a statement that Varanasi is 650 kilometers from Delhi. Suppose I write the statement. So here we find that this is very objective kind of statement which is giving information about the distance between Varanasi and Delhi. But suppose I make a statement that Varanasi is very far from Delhi. So in this way, this statement shows the emotional aspect, right? So in this way, if a communication is oriented towards addressor, how the addressor is emphasizing that particular thing, so emotive function becomes dominant in language. Similarly, if the function is angled towards the receiver of the message or the addressee, the conative function dominates. And if the communication is inclined towards context, then the phatic function dominates. And if the communication is oriented towards code, the metalingual function dominates. However, for this metalingual function to be operative, the code has to be understood by both of the sides. So, right, so in that kind of communication, for example, if suppose an addressor is saying something to an addressee in which this metalingual function dominates, so the code is understood by both people. So we can say that in that sentences, such things can be asked that understand and question mark, got it and question mark. So these kinds of utterances may be there. So finally, we find that if communication is oriented towards the message for its own sake, then poetic or aesthetic function has to be dominant because their message is important. And in this way, we find that how this act of communication systematically undermines the sense of any natural or transparent connection between signifier and signified or sign and objects. So Jacobson says that in this way it deepens the fundamental dichotomy of signs and objects. And in this way, Jonathan Culler has suggested that Jacobson's work largely constitutes a hypothesis about the conventions of poetry as an institution, and in particular about the kind of attention to language which poets and readers are allowed to assume. So if we look at, Jacobson's concept, we find that, poetry does not serve merely to convey information about an external world. It is auto-referential and it is a self-contained system. In this way, if we try to understand structural view of language, it is similar to this, that language does not refer to any outside reality. Language for structuralists is not referential in nature, rather it is self-referential. It refers to itself. It does not refer to any outside reality. So in this way, the literary work foregrounds its own sign processes, breaking all the illusion of transparency between signifier and signified. So this conceptualization aligns with the formalist goal of integrating form and content that underpins the later structuralist theories. Ultimately, Jacobson offers a universal model that not only redefines poetry, but proposes that all literary and communicative acts are shaped by competing forces of metaphor and metonymy, and in this way his model serves as a theoretical bridge between Russian formalism and French structuralism and remains foundational in literary and linguistics theory. You have to follow this assignment for week 5. Structuralism assumes that all human activity operates through systems. Look around you and name 5 important systems that govern and structure our social life. For instance, system of food, system of dress, system of wrestling match, etc. Second, point out similarities and differences between new criticism and structuralism in 5 statements. Third, give 5 examples of syntagmatic arrangement of words from paradigmatic axis. For example, you draw a paradigmatic axis, write whole range of words and make a syntagmatic arrangement out of that. Name critics who undertake the study of myths in literary criticism. So in this way, I come to the end of this lecture. Thank you.